I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. On today's episode, we are continuing our issue spotting series on AI and the law with a focus on AI and the public sector. From streamlining public services to enhancing national security, AI is rapidly becoming a cornerstone of how governments operate, or maybe at least how they would like to operate. The Trump administration, for example, here in the United States, has emphasized that AI can create a more efficient and cost effective government in areas like tax audits and airport screenings, and with so much more promise on the horizon. But what does meaningful adoption look like at the federal level? How is the government navigating the promise of AI while also managing and identifying the pitfalls of this powerful technology? And then importantly, what can we learn in the private sector from the government's experience on grappling with these really difficult issues? Joining me today to discuss these issues and more is Taka Ariga. Taka has previously held the roles at the federal government's Office of Personnel Management, or OPM, where he served as the Chief AI Officer and Chief Data Officer. And he's also serves as the Chief Data Scientist at the U.S. Government Accountability Office, or the GAO. Now, in the private sector, he is currently advising companies and governments at all levels on how AI can be integrated into government systems, the challenges of that implementation, and what the future might hold for public sector innovation. Taka, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Scott, for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
So, Taka, as I understand it, the ways that you have played those variety of roles of the federal government is really playing a leading role in the government's view about how it can adopt AI in connection with its operations. You had roles at the GAO, at the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, for example, is the primary entity who manages a very large and robust federal workforce for which there is a potential for AI innovations. Maybe you can start just by talking a little bit about your roles and within those organizations and those offices and how you started to approach AI questions.
Yeah, happy to. And I think the governmental entity sometimes has this sort of bad stereotype that we're behind the curve when it comes to technology adoption. But really, all you have to look is at the most current AI inventory. Year over year, there's been more than 100% increase in the number of AI use cases. So this year alone, more than 1,700 AI use cases have been reported across many, many agencies to the Office of Management and Budget. And I think this is a reflection in which the federal government itself sees a tremendous opportunity and value that AI can generate. But there's also that sort of counterbalancing point to say, as a federal entity, there are certain democratic values that we uphold. So we don't necessarily get to say, oops, when it comes to privacy issue, legality, when data quality. So how do we make sure that the accountability part of this conversation go alongside with the speed of innovation? And that's, I think, especially important in an international stage as we continue to sort of speak about competitiveness of AI vis-a-vis our colleagues in the Western Hemisphere, for sure, but certainly with our adversaries such as China and Russia. So it's very important set of dialogue to make sure that while the innovation is happening at a breakneck speed, that we're still upholding the kind of governance, the kind of risk management practices that sort of upholds the democratic value.
So I would really want to dive to each one of those points because they're really good ones, Taka. Maybe we first start with the one you mentioned about the promise of AI, right? You mentioned all of the many use cases that are out there, each one of which is presumably being reviewed and being initiated because it could help the government's operations. From your perspective and vantage point, sitting at these key leadership roles within the agencies, where do you see that the government can best be able to benefit from what AI can offer?
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, and this may be a minority opinion on this one, I do think AI is more than just a technology. It should be a direct extension of data. Because especially within the public sector domain, the kind of information that we feed into these AI models oftentimes are non-public sensitive information for the purpose of serving, whether it's constituents, whether it's mission specific delivery. So that's number one. The second part, I think part of what the kind of conversation that we're trying to drive within both at OPM and GAO is that there is no one AI that rules them all. There are very specific different kinds of archetype. You can use something, for example, a browser-based AI system to augment your general productivity, summarization, meeting transcription, things of that nature. You can certainly have a procured products that are very narrowly focused, such as Grammarly or even some of the Adobe product that are really good at using AI to generate images or even content. Most of what I focus my energy on, at least for institutions, is sort of in this category of bespoke solution, where because the function and the mission is so specific to that organization, there isn't really a sort of market ready solution out there. So you necessarily will have to adapt, whether that's the data, whether that's the model or the workflow behavior in a way that is specific to your organization. But let's face it, most organizations, their core mission isn't about training models, isn't about, sort of defining data in a way that is sort of relevant from a sort of interaction perspective. So while this is the kind of bespoke solution offers the greatest value organizationally, it perhaps also offers the highest risk from, whether the risk of hallucination or whether the risk of sustainment and operational efficiency going forward. So I try to be very specific around when we talk about AI strategy, what different archetype that are most sort of relevant to an organization. I would just add one more point. There is one type of AI that actually they keep me up at night. I call them these sort of surprising AI. Given the hype cycle that we're in, every now and then I would turn on my laptop and all of a sudden I get this new notification to say, try this new AI feature. And of course, my first email will be to my chief information officer to say, what is this? Who turned that on? And did we ask for it? And what was the risk management posture around that particular new feature? So I think there's even within the industry, a lot of pressure from the product side to sort of release these AI feature that oftentimes as an institution we may not be aware of. We may not have the risk management sort of process around it. So to me, the sort of the surprising or even the hidden type of AI probably pose the most sort of operational risk to the organization.
Yeah, we should talk about how the government and from your perspective would try to address those risks. But if I'm kind of just thinking about this in very practical terms, I mean, are we thinking that, eventually at some point, Social Security benefits will be, your primary way of communicating about those is not going to be through a call center. It's going to be through a chatbot, or, that we're going to have the TSA be their scanning of particular backpacks and suitcases is going to be first identifying kind of threats through AI tools. I mean, I guess really the question here is the premise of AI in government one where we think it's realistic that government's going to be cheaper to operate with the uses of AI and maybe more effective, or is that too much to hope for?
Yeah, I think the jury may still be out there relative to the cost because with any given new technology, you will have additional complexity. So, for example, the cost of training the models, the cost of using those models in terms of that token, the cost of having additional staff that are capable of doing continuous monitoring or even the performance calibration going forward. But I do think from a productivity perspective, there's certainly a lot of well-documented example where you could really measure the improvement in productivity. I mentioned sort of meeting transcription, for example, in law firm, in professional services firm, in public sector entity that I support. Certainly, there are a lot of at the sort of employee level griping about how you need to have multiple people on a meeting, and some of them are focused on transcription, and you have to review that transcription. So if you're able to sort of cut that sort of manual processing down, then that allows you to focus those workforce into perhaps higher value kind of analyses. So I think that is anecdotally is proliferating across the public sector as well. Certainly, there are a lot of generalized productivity kind of use cases that I'm seeing, but more and more at least especially at OPM, we're talking about how do you use AI to improve the hiring process. So for those that's ever applied to federal government, sometimes that could be a very maddening exercise given the bureaucracies involved. I've seen use cases where a Veterans Affairs is thinking about how they can use AI to guide the sort of the benefits application process because, in the time of need, you don't always necessarily translate that need into some of the bureaucratic sort of speak that is necessary to get through the adjudication process. So there's certainly a lot of, I think, exciting opportunities out there. I think the key for a public sector entity is how do you make sure that you're dotting the I's and crossing the T from a technology point of view, from a data point of view, from a governance point of view, and from a legality point of view. And one thing I do think public sector is driving the accountability conversation perhaps further than most other domain. Just take a look at the most recent OMB guidance. In one of the sections, it actually requires all the agencies to solicit feedback from the general public if those sort of constituents have sort of decision made on their behalf using models. I think this is one of the perhaps the earliest example on a class of technology where we're affirmatively asking for feedback from the end user and from those whose life may be impacted by the decision-making algorithm. And so I think that's a very sort of, I think, heartening development to make sure that as we move forward in sort of achieving the promises of AI, that we do so responsibly, but certainly with privacy, legality, and due process in mind.
Yeah, very interesting. And maybe one of the other things I just wanted to pick at on the things you were mentioning, right? The many use cases that are out there. And especially kind of from an OPM perspective, as these different types of bulletins are being put into place and different types of guidance, one of the issues that I know you deal with now in the private sector and advising your clients in areas that I certainly see all the time is just trying to get a handle on how employees are leveraging the vast amount of AI solutions that are out there, whether those be enterprise types or enterprise enabled AI solutions or probably, much more expansively, just the consumer oriented AI solutions that are out there. Think that if you were leveraging a popular AI chatbots that are available for download on your phone, and you'd say, hey, maybe I could leverage this in connection with my day-to-day operations in the public sector. That is something that I think a lot of commercial private entities would see as like, oh, yes, this is happening all the time. And they're coming up with a variety of governance strategies to try to get out ahead of it. But the federal government's workforce is much bigger. Their mandate is much larger than any private organization. So how is it that the federal government would try to get after those types of issues? And perhaps what can the private sector learn from that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I once worked with a CIO within a federal agency, and the mantra was she wished the technology at work will work exactly the way the technology might work at home, right? So at home, you have Siri, you have Alexa, you have smart videos, smart camera. I think notionally, I agree with that sentiment. But the reality we live in is that we probably don't want public sector employee to be using browser-based AI system to upload non-public sensitive information, just because we can't really control and specifically understand what then this downstream impact of that disclosure might look like. So in that case, something that I advocate, especially for an institution that will require a level of sort of heightened care, but also constraint around what a LLM may or may not be able to do, is that maybe ironically that adding constraints to these AI behavior actually allow the users to be freer. So that's from a sort of solution development perspective. But certainly, I think it begins with policy, right? Be very clear with the employees on what can be done and what cannot be done. And then having a sort of continuous monitoring framework behind it to make sure the compliance is adhered to based on that policy. So I think it's a combination of these enablement. But I also don't subscribe the sort of sentiment that AI will become the Terminator, will replace all of us. Certainly there's been well documented example how AI can now pass the bar exam, for example, or the medical exam, or even able to do surgery on a sort of solo robotic level. But what I do believe is that the future will be demarcated in a way that accountants who use AI well versus accountants that don't. Analysts that use AI well versus analysts that don't, lawyers that uses AI well versus lawyers that don't. And so I do think, while there will be short-term disruption, but if we take it at its face value that AI will be a sort of pervasive part of our work and our lives, let's make sure that we are training the employees well, right? So that they understand not just general concepts around what is AI, what is LLM, what is prompt engineering, but more specifically, how are these capabilities manifesting within my organization, right? How does AI work within OPM or GAO or Hogan Lovel in a way that is specific to your function? So I do see a little bit of gap beyond the generalized training content and how do we upskill employees in a sort of organizational specific use of AI.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and obviously, kind of probably will be the mission for many of us as we are trying to instill and embrace AI in a responsible way. I think one of the other things you mentioned here, Taka, was around governance. Now, maybe to think about this, we'd say AI innovation, AI use cases, AI technology, the data that's being ingested in it, right? That's moving almost at lightning speed.
Mhm.
And every day, at least in my practice, and I'm sure in your work, you're seeing all new and innovative ways of using AI to be able to create additional efficiencies, new value, unlock other opportunities that were thought to be ones that could never be touched. However, in order to do that, you go very, very quickly. Now, governance, I think one of the areas that there's a lot of concern about is that governance acts as a natural roadblock
Sure.
to some of those use cases. Certainly slows it down because you're adding many more voices and stakeholders into that conversation. Maybe you have to, given all the risks that are associated with it.
Mhm.
But then to make that even more complicated, from your vantage point, is add government to that, which obviously I don't know anyone who thinks the government moves very quickly at all. You mentioned earlier around the need for accountability, the idea of consultation with, citizens and stakeholders, and to be able to embrace the idea of how different members of the federal workforce can be able to leverage AI. Obviously, all of that takes time, all of that takes deliberation. And you can imagine, right? All of these things together, at the one hand, we're thinking this is an immediate opportunity. Let's get our arms around it and move it very fast.
Yeah.
Oh, you have this governance structure. You have to get all of these different approvals. Oh, and you are also now having the public sector morass of moving very slowly. How within that dynamic are you seeing that AI decisions can be made effectively quickly enough to make sure that we're not missing the opportunity while at the same time staying true to the core mission of these public sector organizations?
Yeah, and this is a topic that I spend a lot of my energy on. So maybe if you sort of unpack the notion of what does accountability even mean in an AI sense? So a couple years ago, everyone was talking about responsible and accountable implementations of AI, and maybe this is just me. And I started asking questions of, well, what does that mean, right? This is not like a physician's Hippocratic oath to say do no harm. What does that mean from an algorithm perspective? What does that mean from data perspective? And back in, I think, early 2020, 2021, there really wasn't any sort of concrete example of what an accountable and responsible model of AI implementation looks like. And so when I was at GAO, we ended up producing this framework called the GAO's AI Accountability Framework. And it really is meant as a blueprint for evaluator auditors to take an evidence-based approach looking at the lifecycle AI development from governance to model to data to continuous monitoring to say, don't just tell me that your AI is not biased. Show me. What are some of the deliberative points? What are some of the choices? What are some of the sort of guardrails that you have baked in your implementation that gives us an independent auditor confidence that the behavior of this particular solution is sort of working as intended and it's not drifting over time. So subsequently, NIST has come out with their AI risk management framework that has been widely adopted, and certainly I think the conversation around accountability has been proliferating. But to your point around the notion of governance being a more like acting as a brake to the speed of innovation, certainly that is true if we are relying on the traditional model of enterprise risk management, where most organization probably has some sort of ERM structure. They probably meet once a month, once a quarter to talk about all sorts of risk issue. And so under that paradigm, I would at best get 5 minutes on that agenda to talk about the perhaps most complicated set of technical issues that are, certainly complex. But AI has so much horizontal consideration around copyrights, around legality, procurement, you name it. And so it was not a reasonable paradigm to really trying to fit governance structure under your traditional risk management framework. And so I think more and more organizations are starting to adopt this notion of agile governance. I'll give you an example. At OPM, what that really meant was we took a two pizza rule, right, and convene a group of cross-sectoral experts. So these are lawyer, privacy experts, procurement. We even had the bargaining unit at the table to sort of talk about human capital impacts. We had technologists, we had data scientists. And this particular group, we met on a biweekly basis. But more importantly, we were empowered to make tactical decisions that come up all the time. Technology choices, architectural choices, model choices, data choices, things like that as these use cases were being developed. And that was, I think, an important differentiator to make sure that the governance is moving at the speed of innovation. Certainly, more systemic issue gets elevated at the agency level to deliberate, right? That's budgetary consideration, sort of staffing, resourcing consideration. Those will all get elevated in a way that I think is appropriate to have an agency-wide input. But relative to individual use case, the risk profile may be different, the technology choices may be different. And so we really need to have a sort of faster approach to address individualized concern. And so, for example, the use of something like Microsoft Office 365 Copilot, the risk profile of that is very generalized. You're summarizing emails, you're summarizing PowerPoint presentation, whereas we may be developing a very specific use cases that may touch on PII or even HIPAA information. So how do we address the concern, the guardrails, the risk management sort of perspective in a way that while the development is happening, we're not bottlenecking all of these concerns on some monthly or quarterly conversation. And so I think more and more this is becoming a necessary part of reimagining what that governance should look like in a digital age.
It's fascinating the way that you were describing that because I think one of the things that makes the public sector portion interesting as a little bit of a AI laboratory is just the many considerations that the government has that maybe in the private sector you don't have. And importantly, how is it that we can learn how to solve from those challenges? So, for example, if I am thinking about, the various ways that private sector is looking to AI, usually there's some sort of problem that they're looking to be able to address, some sort of inefficiency, some sort of opportunity. They identify what that looks like, then they have different tooling that they can be able to leverage that, identifying the data that's going to be relevant, the tooling, the outputs, the inputs, all of those things, right? So we have that, and that ends up being kind of very specific, typically in a very specific, operations. Here in doing so, we are very, looking at the areas that are always important as part of any AI risk management program, looking at safety, looking at, a bias, looking at accuracy, looking at, privacy, all of the various many things that go through. But we have almost a limited number of stakeholders. And we are also answering that question typically with the frame of making sure that we're trying to solve a particular question and a specific obligation. And the government, my guess is that it's those same issues, but compounded by a number of other considerations that private sector doesn't have. So for example, if I am thinking about, accuracy or safety in this context, typically that's saying, okay, well, is that going to create a problem for my business operations? Here in the public sector, if they were to implement AI in a way that's going to create a safety or accuracy concern, you may end up having real world consequences for individuals, and that could threaten, life or property. And that is not typically, top of mind for many of the AI use cases that the private sector has. So I guess maybe my question is, how is it that the public sector can seek to even define what the problem is that they're looking to solve through the uses of AI versus saying, hey, here's AI, maybe this could do really cool things for us, let's embrace it?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And I think the way I'm going to answer that is really, I think it's the public sector that has been driving this position called the chief AI officer. Not because we needed yet another C-suite person, right, just to occupy the leadership, but AI in particular has so much horizontal consideration. You talked about safety consideration. One another sort of example I might delineate public sector from sort of commercial sector consideration is in a governmental entity sense, we don't typically monetize data, right, for the purpose of revenue. And so when that's the case, privacy sort of exfiltration becomes very sort of much a top of mind concern. And so there's so much horizontal sort of discussion that needs to happen. The way that I talk about it is you need to treat AI development more like a team sport as opposed to, oh, that's a data scientist's problem or that's a technologist's problem. So you need to have these horizontal conversations, but you also need to sequencing them in the right way. So whether they're coming in at the ideation stage, whether they're coming in at the prototyping stage, whether they're coming in at the sort of pre-production planning kind of conversation, and all the way down to operational and sustainment, you need the right folks contributing to the right thoughts at the right time to make those decisions going forward. And that's how I've been addressing these issues at both GAO and OPM to say it's very difficult to sort of monolithically think about DAI and try not to like think them in some sort of automagical way to say, well, if we were just had this one model in this one way, we're able to sort of accomplish what we may ultimately want to do. So at each life cycle phase of this conversation, you want to bring in different people. And so I think chief AI officers sort of accomplishes that goal, which is a little bit different than what I'm seeing in a private sector that may have starting to rely on your chief compliance officer to deal with a lot of those conversations. Because part of the sort of chief AI role is also prospectively looking forward to say not just about compliance in a rear view mirror in a sense, but also how might things go sideways and anticipate those conversations. And then the second part, I think for most chief AI officer, at least is the way that is written within the EO and the OMB guidance, is that they report to either the head or the deputy head of that agency. That means this position is empowered in a way to make certain decision that is different than maybe your traditional technology stack like cloud or even data center, where there are very specific requirements that the CIO has to follow. But because of the horizontal nature and the impacts of AI, it's important to have that person at the right altitude to orchestrate these discussions and make these decisions and making sure that in fact it is a team sport, not a technologist, not a data scientist, not a mathematician kind of conversation. I'll tell you this, data scientists and technologists are great, but they tend to come up with a technical solution that perhaps missing that sort of user experience consideration or even sort of policy sort of considerations around redress, around clarity of the reasoning, things like that. So I do think the way that we address that, certainly it is overwhelming sometimes, how fast the technology is moving versus the kind of mission that we have to carry out. And I mentioned this before, we don't get to say oops in the name of innovation. And so how do we apply that agile governance in a way that bring all of these stakeholders in at the right time, but empowering something like the chief AI officer to make the decision? I jokingly always say, I always have my resume updated because if something goes wrong, I'm the first to go, right? So how do we test it? How do we evaluate it? How do we take calculated risk? Especially in an AI world, there is no absolute. I mean, AI by definition is probabilistic. The answer that you get on Monday may be slightly different than the answer you get on Thursday. And you're going to have to be okay with that in terms of your risk posture. So not only is the team sports aspect important, I always tell the leadership to say, it's one thing for us to implement AI, but I think the bidirectional expectation should also be once that AI solution is operational, that we also do a look back on reimagining what those risk tolerance, what those processes should have been. So we're not just automating the legacy processes, we're actually approaching a digital native or digital first approach that AI can really help to accelerate.
Yeah, and maybe another distinction that I'm interested in your perspective on, and then I want to hear a little bit about how you're thinking about the learnings you've received in your role in the government and how you're deploying that with for private sector organizations. But from the government's point of view, their AI, one of the powers of it is it may result in more efficiencies to accomplish political objectives,
Sure.
right? And I don't mean that to be in the pejorative sense of politics. It's just that, in democratic organizations and basically any organization, you are going to be making sure you're implementing the priorities of the leadership of the organizations, and that those priorities can shift based on a number of different factors. So, for example, just today, I think we're recording this mid-July 2025, the White House and the Trump administration announced new AI-oriented initiatives and priorities and spoke about bias, but didn't speak about bias in the context of some of the ways that often AI is thought about for bias, things around, issues surrounding biases against racial minorities or other sensitive populations, but thought about bias in the context of ideology and saying that, can you use AI that's going to result in the bias toward liberal causes versus conservative causes, or liberal ways of thinking versus conservative ways of thinking. The whole issue that we had with social media, that has been the large focus of the debate over the course of the past, 5 plus years. But you can imagine that that is just an example of something much larger. You can use
Sure.
AI to be able to detect, the probability of that somebody is in the United States unlawfully. You can use AI for purposes of identifying fraud and abuse, if that is the political mantra of the day, right?
Right.
You can use AI to be able to target any number of different things that you're looking to be able to accomplish from a political objective, and putting aside the effectiveness or efficiency of the tool itself. So, from your perspective, how does that enter into a governance process for evaluation? Because many of the people who are evaluating those are not necessarily the policy makers. The policy makers are being identified by somebody else, but they are the ones who are responsible for implementing it. And that strikes me as a real challenge to effectively say, okay, I have the role of doing this lawfully in a responsible way, but also making sure that I'm pushing forward the mission of those who are have the roles of making policy and setting policy.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And when I was at GAO, this is a topic that I actually had a chance to socialize with a lot of the congressional committees and staffer, right? Even within the legislative branch in a post-Chevron world, there's been a lot of talk about increasing the legislative capacity through AI as Congress is expecting to do more rulemaking on any topic area. And one of the sort of key concern I had at the time was, well, I really hope we don't end up creating like a Democratic chatbot versus like a Republican chatbot, even though the technical capabilities is there. And at least at the time in those conversations, there seems to be like a uniform agreement that, yeah, we just want to do good legislative work, good constituent support work, and not really looking to amplify the partisanship part of that conversation. Now, that may be just what I'm hearing and maybe slightly naive on my part. But the way I address that is continue to make sure the models, the configuration, the technical sort of setup of any AI use case have the right sort of and transparent reasoning, right? You could be providing a response in a way that, certain people might be objectionable, and versus other might be cheering for it. But as long as that reasoning is transparently produced with the right citation, And I think this is where the GAO use case is a good example of that. I think you'll agree that auditor perhaps is probably some of the most risk averse folks when it comes to relying anything that even smells like a magical solution where AI sometimes can be, because there's so much methodological impact, there's so much independence, there's so much sort of nonpartisanship part of the ethos that auditors usually carry on. So developing AI solution for auditors usually is a very challenging part of the sort of the strategy. So at GAO, but also with other sort of clients I'm advising, a lot of what I focus on is making sure that the reasoning, the citation, the source is crystal clear so that individuals who are using that capability, but more importantly, when it comes to peer review process, they can also independently review what was the reasoning behind the output, what were the citation of that output, and you can sort of apply that judgment at that level to say whether the response was neutral, biased, or partisan. So not necessarily at the sort of policy level to dictate that conversation, but I think a lot of technologists, a lot of data scientists are well trained to make sure that kind of sort of configuration, that kind of sort of lineage, sort of information is part of generating trustworthy output. Right. So this goes, I think, beyond partisanship. Even as a sort of casual user of sort of ChatGPT that may be sort of creating travel itinerary, I probably would want to know what was the basis for that restaurant recommendation, or what was the basis for that particular sort of route of, sort of transit, things like that. I think it's as a user in general, it just helps me to have greater trust to that information. And so I think there's a lot of sort of technical ability to make sure that reasoning, citation, and I think more and more this concept of observability, right? Is your AI solution shifting from one perspective to another? That's from a security point of view, that's from a modeling point of view, that's from data point of view. And so I think there are really sort of robust set of technical ability, but you're absolutely right. The tone starts from the top in terms of what are you really using AI for? And so how do you comply to not just the letter of the EO, the OMB guidance, or any legislative sort of statutes out there, but how do you comply to the spirit of those guidance? And certainly, we don't operate in vacuum. There are other good examples from our friends across Atlantic and with the EU AI Act. Our friends in Canada have done a lot of great work when it comes to the kind of a policy sort of governance structure for AI. So I'm optimistic that this is partly policy, but also partly technical issue that could be resolved. And in the conversation I'm having with most of my colleagues, they do understand that while we're living in a hyper partisan world, that if you provide the reasoning and citation and the clarity of that response, it goes a long way to addressing the trust quotient.
Yeah, I think that's good guidance. Maybe as we finish here, Taka, I'm just kind of interested in, your work now in the private sector, including, I understand you were working with a number of private organizations and also, municipalities and government organizations as they initiate and evolve with all of their AI journeys. I guess my question here is thinking of your experience in the federal government. Where do you see that the biggest opportunities lie for private organizations to learn from what the government is doing? And then importantly, where do you see the opportunities lie for municipalities and governments to learn from how private organizations are managing these issues? Because my guess is that both sides have unique value to contribute to AI management and AI governance that really can help both the private and public sectors.
Yeah, no, that absolutely. I think from maybe the industry perspective, looking into the government space, I think having just clear understanding of why a public sector sort of domain is hard. Like I mentioned this, we don't get to say oops. So there like a very high bars to clear when it comes to security. So, at the federal level, if a vendor doesn't really understand what a FISMA or FedRAMP standards are, we're having different conversation. Federal government and other governmental entity are also full of these analog processes that it's very difficult for a digital solution like AI to exist in a way that is independent or devoid of other sort of impact. So understanding what does that landscape look like from existing policy perspective. Data, another good example. Government is not in the business of monetizing that information. So how do we leverage, for example, retrieval augmented generation or some of these more novel way of constraining the AI behavior, not to rely on the best of the Wikipedia and the Reddits out there, but specifically based on trusted governmental sources in a way that, again, generates more trust around that output. I think that's an important consideration. But I think most of us who's been working in the government space know that while we love governmental data, it is sometimes questionable in terms of completeness, quality, or even reliability. And depending on which agency you're talking to, you may have, three similar looking data set that have 10 different meanings, right? So how do you reconcile that? It's very much of a challenge. From a governmental perspective, I certainly, going back to this notion of governance, even though governmental entity is not necessarily a revenue generating or profit making entity, I think there's some reflections around how do we, for example, evolve our risk management in a way that is continuous. So policy is not just publish it and set in stone and never evolve, right? How do we have a sort of continuously evolving policy as technology evolve in a way that we can sort of append to that policy on the do's and don'ts? How do we reimagine these sort of risk tolerance? Oftentimes I see example where even though it's publicly available information, we apply so much energy around making sure that that information doesn't leak. Like it's a public available information. You can Google it right now. We don't need to sort of apply extra layer of protection on top just because it's sort of AI used for AI purposes. And so how do we then having that calibrated, reimagined sort of risk management framework in through the eyes of a digital capability, not through the eyes of like an analog process. So if we want the information to be interoperable, stop using PDF as the primary source of that information, right? Convert them to HTML, for example. So I think there's certainly a lot of synergy from the sort of great learning that the private sector, even at Silicon Valley, can sort of bring to the government domain. While I think government is really setting the tones around what accountability, what good governance might look like. And so I think this is really exciting time for this kind of partnership to go forward.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Well, Taka, I really appreciated your insights and expertise on this episode, and thank you so much for sharing that with our audience.
Been a pleasure. Thank you so much, Scott.
With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.